Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava. This is the second half of my interview with Economist Bryan Caplan. The first half, which was last week's episode, was about his book, The Case Against Education. This second half now is about some of his work on non-state legal systems. It's a totally different topic, so the two episodes do stand completely on their own if you haven't listened to last week's, although I, of course, recommend it. You don't need to have listened to it in order to listen to understand what we talk about in this one. And I think that covers it. Here's the episode. Hey, so let me switch gears, because I do want to get a chance to ask you some questions about non-state legal systems.
All right, cool.
So this is a lot of this stuff is on your website under your early writing section for people who want to check it out, although again, I'll put up some links. So you've written in defense of non-state legal systems. So let's kind of start from the basics. So the idea of providing law without a state providing it. So the usual economic argument goes, the reason you would never do that is because law is a public good. So can you kind of give a very quick summary of what that means? What is that argument?
Yeah. All right. So, I mean, the real argument is a little bit different. So, I mean, just to step back, and what in the world would a non-state legal system be? It's not science fiction. It exists already. So like private arbitration, that would be a non-state legal system. If you have a dispute, a credit card dispute, you don't go and take the company to court. You go and call up the Visa Corporation, and they have a room somewhere where they have people who go and adjudicate these kinds of things. Or if you have a complaint on Facebook or Twitter, you can go and email the company and they make a ruling on it. So, I mean, the stuff is already going on all the time. This is not a weird science fiction thing. A complaint that's been made about these kinds of systems is just that they'll naturally tend to free ride off the government, because coming up with a new rule is basically it's like research and development. You're putting effort into getting a new idea, and a general fact about new ideas is that they're hard to come up with, but they're easily stolen. And so there's a paper by Richard Posner and Landis and Posner, where they say, look, the problem with these non-state legal systems is, they may be fine at expeditiously applying existing rules, but they're not going to be good at creating new rules. They're just going to free ride off the government, and then the government, paid for by funded by taxpayers, is going to be the one that organizations that do the legal innovation, right? And the main thing to say about that is, if you look at the world, it's just not true. It's totally standard for non-state legal systems to come up with their own rules. In fact, it's one of the main things that they offer. As to what's wrong with the original argument, there's actually tons of private innovation. And in general, governments are not very innovative. So, when they pour money into a specific thing, like the space program, they can be innovative. But in general, almost all the practical innovation that we encounter comes from the private sector. And while there is this problem of just copying new ideas, it's not that severe of a problem. There's often like a first mover advantage. The first place that applies a new idea gets most of the benefit, even though it's legal for others to copy them. So for like Facebook, I could go and start Bryan Book today using exactly the same idea, but I probably wouldn't be very successful, even though they're the ones that came up with all the ideas, and most of what they do is cannot be copyrighted. They can't copyright the idea of a social media site. They can't copy the idea of people having friends with each other. So, and yet I'm not going to do this. And I don't think I would succeed with this. Right. So that's the main story there. So
basically, that legal copyright protection is somewhat overrated in terms of being effective.
Yeah, it's got to be. I mean, remember, there are a bunch of weird areas where, just for purely historical reasons, you cannot. There's no intellectual property. For example, fragrances. You cannot get a patent on a fragrance. Why? I don't know. But nevertheless, new fragrances do occur, right? So, new perfumes and colognes happen all the time, and despite the fact that it is totally legal for a rival to reverse engineer your product and then sell something chemically identical, but this doesn't prevent this innovation from happening. To some degree, you might say there'd be more if you could go and patent a fragrance, but there's still plenty that goes on even without that protection.
So, in one of the things that you wrote on this, you sort of split up legal services into three basic categories. So there's arbitration, which is deciding actually who's, according to the law that we've agreed on, who's right, who's wrong. Actual rule formation, creating the laws, and that's some of what you were just talking about. And then there's enforcement. So can you talk a little bit about enforcement without the state? Or
absolutely. So why don't we just do all three? So again, like when you hear this phrase non-state legal systems, this sounds like some weird science fiction anarchistic idea. And the very first place to begin with understanding this stuff is that it's not science fiction. It exists right here, right now, on a large scale. Right. So for private enforcement of laws. So first of all, there's private security guards. Last time I checked, there were more private security guards in America than police. All right. So this is not some rare or weird thing. It's all over it's all over the place. Right. So, if you're in the mall and you cause trouble, they're probably not going to call the police. They're just going to call private security, and they will escort you to the edge and say, go away. We don't want you here. Many other kinds of private enforcement. So there's ostracism. Right. So if you behave badly on Twitter, Twitter's not going to sue you. They're going to kick you off, and you're now ostracized. You are not going to be allowed in the system. If you are a company that uses credit cards and you make the Visa Corporation mad at you, they're highly unlikely to sue you. They're just going to say, fine, you can't use the Visa Corporation anymore. We're cutting off your access to our computer, and you're out of here. You can't use Visa anymore. Right. So ostracism and boycott, also very widely used right here, right now. And then something else is bonding, where you could go and post a bond, where you go and say, look, if I'm putting a $50,000 bond up into this escrow account, if I'm ever found guilty of causing trouble, then you can take the payment right out of that bond, and then there's no issue with collecting, saying, oh, take me to court. Say, well, we don't have to take you to court because you already posted this $50,000 bond in an escrow account, so we'll just go right there and take the money, and that's it. Problem solved. So there's all kinds of private enforcement that exists right now. Secondly, there's private adjudication, right, in the form of all of these arbitration systems that I've been mentioning. Right. So, it's very standard when you do a business contract to say if there's a dispute, this will be arbitrated. There are, and then there's, there's internal systems. Again, Visa would have its internal system, Facebook, Twitter, all these social media accounts would have their own internal systems for adjudicating disputes. And then again, the last thing is the formation of rules, where if you are someone offering these adjudication services, one of the things that you do to pump up consumer demand is to say we've got a bunch of rules that work. We've got rules that quickly settle disputes, that are reasonable, that are fair, that again don't cost a lot of money, that don't waste a lot of time on issues that aren't really important anyway. I mean, one of the main things you'll see in arbitration is normally you get people who are experts in the industry to go and hear the case. So if it's a maritime case, you get someone who specializes in maritime law. Or again, if it's whatever, you get someone who is it's a dispute in the computer industry, you probably get someone who knows that industry, and this way you can get a better ruling than you can with a general judge, or of course with 12 jurors who just weren't able, who probably know next to nothing about anything, right? So these are all ways that you can improve things, and again, these are all things that already exist. So the main thing that I do, the reason that I talk about it, though, is to say, well, given they already exist, they could clearly be expanded somewhat. And then the question is just how far can they be expanded?
So before going there to how far they can be expanded, a question which I think for some economists will be kind of like a well, duh kind of question, but for some of my audience may not be. I think what a lot of people in my audience may be thinking right now is this all presumes that it's actually a good thing to leave some of this to the market, right? So I think as an economist, you might think, well, you kind of, you want to leave things to the market, but a lot of times you have the reasons that you can't because of externalities and market failure, what have you. But why do we want to leave this to the market in the first place? And specifically, isn't there a concern that if we expand things and give more of this rule formation and enforcement to the market, that it's just going to make it so that the people with the more money are going to have more power, the rules will be in their favor, the enforcement will be in their favor, and you're just going to have this massively unequal and unfair legal system.
Yeah, so there's a word that economists like a lot, and there's a good reason for it, and the word is competition. So, I mean, here's the main thing to realize, that if in fact a private system will go and make the rules in favor of one side, the result is going to be that people on the other side are going to get a better deal, right? And why? Because of competition. So, for example, right now there's if you go and want to get a job, there are a bunch of non-waivable rights that you have. So there's a bunch of reasons you can sue your employer. Now, because of competition, this means that employers are going to be less interested in hiring people if they know that if they hire you, you can make trouble for them. If this were replaced with a system of private arbitration where you would go and sign the contract and say, I agree, this will be arbitrated by these rules. And again, the rules might indeed, I think probably would be very favorable to the employer, right? But there is a upside of this from the point of view of the worker, which is that once you have reassured employers that you're not causing trouble, this is a reason for them to offer more. And again, well, why should they bother? Because if they don't, the competition will. Right, and that's the way that competition in general works. Is that if it becomes more advantageous for people on one side to do something, this increases their demand, and when demand goes up, this is better for the people that are on the other side of that deal. So, I mean, I say that this view that people would sign away most of the rights is a pretty hefty indictment of the current system we have, because it basically means the current system saddles people with a bunch of rights that are much more costly for the employer to follow than they are beneficial for the worker to receive. Because again, imagine that you're negotiating a contract. You could have a contract. You could go and say, look, you want to hire me? Fine. Tell you what, I'll take a 50% pay cut, but then I can sue you under the following conditions. Right now, an employer might very well say, oh, 50% pay cut. That's pretty attractive. But then you realize, wait a second, I don't want to take a 50% pay cut for the right to sue you. In fact, that seems like an exorbitant price to have to sue you for this right? So there's a reason why people are not very inclined to make these offers. Now, in terms of the general questions like what are the advantages of a private system? A lot of them are just advantages for both sides. So think about this: last time you were disappointed with a product, did you consider suing whoever sold it to you?
No.
No. I routinely ask students, has anyone here ever sued anyone for any reason? No. That's the system the government provides for fixing our problems, and almost no one uses it. Almost no one would consider using it. It's just considered to be such a crummy, horrible system, so bureaucratic, so frustrating, takes so long to get any kind of satisfaction that it's just not worthwhile. And this is the view of essentially everyone, regardless of their political views. On the other, how many people have ever gone and just complained about a charge on a credit card bill? How many people have ever gone and just complained and put a bad review on a website? Again, these are much more. How many people have ever at a restaurant just said, "I'm not happy with my order"? Right? These are all ways the market goes and handles disputes, and these are ones that we all use because they work. They are cheap. They're effective. They are not endlessly frustrating. It's not like banging your head against a wall, right? So I just say, based upon firsthand experience, people much prefer the private systems. So it's a reason to try to figure out a way to expand them.
So, all right. So let's talk about expanding. So everything that you've talked about so far essentially presumes that people have mutually agreed upon some kind of a contract that has the rules, so it's simple enough to arbitrate. There'll be some mechanism for enforcement. Can we expand this to just general society where I could violate somebody's right? We haven't pre-signed anything. How would that potentially work?
Right. So there are a bunch of ways that it already works. So one of them is just the presumption that if you enter someone's property, then you agree to their rules. Right, so that's how the mall works, for example. Right, so when you're on the mall, you have to abide by mall rules, right? Or similarly like homeowners association. So this is one where often you don't sign any contract saying specifically joining the homeowners association. Instead, when the homes are first built, the original owner signs a contract, and then they sign and the contract also says that they can't resell to someone else unless you impose the same terms. So this is another way that this happens in practice. And then furthermore, there are a lot of ways that the contractual part of the system can be expanded. So right now, if you sign a contract that says that any dispute will be bindingly arbitrated by the X arbitration company, and with absolutely no right of appeals to the regular legal system, double stampies, no races. If you sign that contract and you take it into arbitration and you're not happy with the result, you can still sue. There's no truly effective way to get binding arbitration in America right now. Right, and again, if from the point of view of people who think the current system is great, this makes sense, because if you had truly binding arbitration, you could get around any regulation, any employment regulation, for example, right? How so? Well, here's suppose that you sign a contract saying if there's any dispute about whether I'm paying you less than minimum wage, it will be arbitrated by my brother. All right, so you sign that contract and then you pay workers less than minimum wage, and it's binding arbitration. So you get paid less than minimum wage, you dispute, but my brother's the court's going to rule in my favor, and so this would be a way of covertly by stealth abolishing the minimum wage. Now, if you think the minimum wage is good, this is a reason why you would want to keep the current system. But in any case, it's clear that you could greatly expand the current system just by having truly binding arbitration. Right now, again, you can argue about whether that's a good idea. I think it is a good idea, and the fact that people are so eager to sign away these rights gives us strong evidence the rights are actually a bad thing. These are basically rights to these are rights that prevent so-called rights that basically prevent you from making deals that would be advantageous for you and the employer. Right. So again, for example, if you want to go and get some job experience, but you're not worth the minimum wage, the current system doesn't let you do that. Right. I mean, there is the unpaid internship proviso. So what if you want to work for half the minimum wage for an internship? Totally illegal. You can work for zero or minimum. You can't work for half the minimum. No system will allow that. All right. Now, so where does going on? But anyway, so if there were truly binding arbitration, like hardcore, ironclad binding arbitration, then it would probably be a much bigger part of the world that we have, because it would be a lot of it would be a way of getting out of a bunch of regulations that are actually socially burdensome, right? Where the value of the regulation value of the right to the person who has the right is less than the cost of offering the right for the employer, and that's a case where you really want to make a deal, right? Think about this. So, how much money how much extra money would an employer have to offer you to waive your right to sue them for any reason? I mean, I think I'd sell that right away for peanuts.
Yeah, probably.
Right. Yeah, I'm not playing. First of all, highly unlikely I'll ever be in that situation, and second of all, if it did, it would be such a horrible burden on me. I probably wouldn't want to do it.
Right.
Right. So I might be willing to sell that right for $5,000. All right. And the employer, on the other hand, is likely to be very happy to pay that, because the cost to them is much worse than the gain to me. Right, they would have to worry about having the whole legal team and just the stress of it all and everything else. So very likely they'd be willing to pay me a lot more than I would ask to go and remove the legal risk. So that seems like a very big improvement on the system. What would replace it? The old system of, if you don't like it, you can quit. There's that system, right? But or again, of course, I mean, I think in the real world, it's likely that there would be at least the arbitration would not literally be the brother of the boss. It would heavily favor the boss, and yet there would still probably be some room just so that workers feel like really super unfair things don't happen to them. Right. Now, in terms of what can you do if there is no conceivable contract of any kind, like there's just no relation, you're true total strangers. So this is one where, again, in the context of the current system, when you go to a government court, they could just say, well, actually now we just have arbitration. So, since you're strangers, no contract. All right. Well, I'll tell you what, here's a list of private arbitrators, and each of you can go and cross off 40% of the names on the list, and then we will give you someone that you mutually agree to. And then that's binding. Right. So in this way, there would still be a government role in the system, but it would be a very small role. It would basically, the government's role would just be to shuffle people into into private arbitration. Right. Now, again, if you start thinking about, the really extreme thing where government isn't playing any role at all, that's where it does get more complicated. But, we can talk about that if you want. But again, in terms of how you could have dramatic expansions of the role for non-state legal systems, that's where I would go. It's just to say, if two total strangers show up at court or file a case, then the court says, all right, well, I see you've got no contract, so I am here to go and slot you into arbitration, and that's what I do, and then I'm done.
So yeah, what about the case then if we didn't have any government at all? How would we take that for that last step of expansion?
Right. So first of all, I recognize this hypothetical seems completely crazy to most people, and that's okay. And I don't want to lose people, make people think everything that I said was crazy just because this is crazy. So in other words, you could agree with everything that I said right now and say this is all sober and reasonable, and now beginning at this point, say I'm crazy. So let's draw that distinction. But again, so basically, what I would say is, right. So first of all, picture as dramatic an expansion of the role of the role of private legal systems that you can imagine without having government disappear. All right. So imagine we're like 95% private, 99% private. There's still just a little bit of government left, and then say at this point, once the system were established and stable, would it really be a big deal if you remove the last government role in the system and just had it be fully private, right? So so now so at this point it's like what would that be like? Key thing to remember. So we're not talking about like doing this suddenly overnight, pressing a button and abolishing the government, which again, like I'm happy to predict would lead to chaos and blood in the streets if it happened overnight. We can just imagine it happening gradually. So to the point where there's a well-established system, people are used to it, and then you say that for this last, very marginal set of issues, there's going to be, in these last marginal set of issues, there's going to the government is just not going to play. Its sort of residual or vestigial role is going to go away, right? And that's where saying, could you just go and push these last remaining rare exceptional cases like back onto say private charity or something like that? And again, that's where I don't see that it would be so hard. Again, the analogy that I like is this. Imagine going back to Sweden in 1000 AD, and you go and you tell them, all right, I got a totally new plan for government. It's called democracy. And the way that it works is like anyone who wants to be the ruler can go and put their name forward, and they talk to us, and then we all go and have a little clay rune that we go and put into a box, and whoever gets the most of these runes gets to become the new leader until the next election. And just imagine all the laughter of those Vikings at you in your face. A hoot, a hoot, a hoot. That's the dumbest idea I ever heard in my whole life. What's going to stop the leader from going and just killing anyone that tries to challenge him? Good luck with that, dummy. All right. And at the time, that they would have been right to laugh, because that is what would have happened, because they're so used to the idea of monarchy that it's just taken for granted that whoever's in power is not going to respect an election. Right, but now, fast forward to modern Sweden. Imagine that the current prime minister finds out that he just lost the election, and then he says, "Here's my plan. We send the military to kill our enemies, and we will rule forever as dictators." All right. If the current Swedish prime minister said this stuff, everyone would assume it was a joke, and if he was serious, then he would just be they would just be removed almost instantly. People would just say, "Get rid of this lunatic." Right, what has changed between Sweden in 1000 AD versus today? Why is it that now democracy is not only possible, but it's the only thinkable thing, whereas 1,000 years ago it would have seemed crazy? Right, and I say it's all about expectations. If people expect there to be dictatorship is stable. If people expect there to be democracy, then democracy is stable. Right, and I say the same thing about a non-state legal system. People expect this is the system. Then the CEO of a company who says, hey, let's go and take our security guards and become the new government would seem like a lunatic, and it won't happen. Right? But again, of course, like the question then is, how do you get to a stable new system? And all I can say is it's super hard, but it clearly happens. It's happened many times before, so why couldn't it happen again?
So I think the maybe what might seem hard for people about taking that last step is the idea that even if you had a minimal government, at least there would be this final arbitration point, right? So if there's a dispute between, so you say, go to this arbitrator or that arbitrator, or these people are forming rules and those people are forming rules. There's a place where the dispute sort of ends, and specifically and crucially, a place where there's violent enforcement and a monopoly on that, so that disputes won't sort of break out into war or what have you. So once you take out that last step, it seems like something sort of crucial has happened. A center has fallen out. So what's your response to that line of objection?
Yeah. So again, depending upon expectations, it could be crucial or it could be barely important at all. So again, right now, insurance company, auto insurance companies will have contracts with each other specifying how they're going to handle disputes. It is possible that after they have gone through all those procedures, one insurance company will say, "Screw this! We're going to take this to court." This hardly ever happens. Why? Well, because it's so costly, and the gain is just not that large from getting your way in this one case. It's better to preserve relations. So similarly, if you imagine a world where all the security is private, there's 100 different security companies. One of them could say, "We don't accept this ruling, and we'll kill you if you don't go along with it." But again, it's just one case. What's the big deal? Wouldn't it be cheaper just to abide by the system rather than risking your life and the lives of all your employees to go and make a big deal out of this? Now, again, in a system where people are expecting this kind of thing to happen, then it very well might happen. But again, one where where people have just accepted that for a very long time, we don't resort to violence on this. This is where the person who says, "Hey, you know what? I think we should resort to violence." That's where that person seems crazy. And you're like, "Well, what are you talking about? Violence? We could get hurt. We don't want to do this," right? And worth pointing out that when you do have a private private security company, the employees the employees that you have, if you want to go and expose them to lethal danger, you're going to have to pay them a lot more money. So it's not just we'll just go and attack them and we'll win and we'll get stuff. It's the employees aren't going to want to do this. The employees are going to, moral scruples aside, they're going to be nervous about getting injured or killed, right? So, people right now sometimes say, "Well, sure, private security is great, but when there's real danger, bring in the SWAT team." It's yeah, well, because the SWAT team's free in those cases. But if private companies did have to hire people for extreme danger, they would be there, but you'd be paying them a ton of money. And this would be this is, of course, a reason to closely limit the amount of extreme danger you want to put your employees into. It's well, is there any way around this situation? Because it does make it more expensive.
I'd like to ask you one more question about this, and that is, so obviously at this point now, what we're talking about is a kind of anarchism, and one of the more common objections to this is that some kind of collusion will happen in this sort of situation. Right. So if you have essentially protection agencies, rights protection agencies or security agencies, what have you, they will probably have to coordinate with each other in order to arbitrate in certain cases. And they're eventually going to realize, if we kind of join forces in some way, coordinate together, we can essentially start... we can put an end to the competition.
We could become the new government. Sure.
Exactly. Yeah. So what's the argument against that?
So if there are only 3 defense companies, this would be a totally reasonable fear. If there's 1,000, on the other hand, is paranoid, right? And what is so the real question is how many firms there actually likely to be. There's a whole economic theory of what determines the number and size of firms. The basic point of the best predictor that we have of what would happen is based upon something that we see in the real world. It seems like right now there's very little sign that there are big economies of scale, which are that's the economic factor that tends to lead there to be a small number of large companies. Said it seems to be a very decentralized industry, so it seems like it's likely to be so under privatization. In fact, with privatization, when demand is much larger, so you're likely to have a lot more firms. So again, as long as there's a large number of firms, the idea that there's going to be collusion to, back to the level of government is just crazy. Just like it'd be crazy to think the restaurants are all going to get together and control the food supply or something like that. So there's that. Now, it seemed like you were alluding to this argument that Tyler Cowen has made, which is that since the whole idea of arbitration is that firms get together and work out rules, once they're working out the rules for arbitration, won't they also work out the rules for collusion? Right. So And again, there is actually a general kind of industry that fits this description called a network industry. I think like phones. What good would a phone be if you couldn't call people who subscribe to other phone companies? It would be crummy, right? Even if the phone were technically awesome, if it can't interconnect, then it's not a good product. All right. And in these network industries, it's very common for competitors to also cooperate with each other. Right. And then Tyler said, well, given that they're already cooperating with each other, aren't they then going to cooperate for, they're cooperating with each other for pro-social aims, like making the product good and useful. Won't they also cooperate for anti-social aims, like restricting competition? Right. And what I say there is, possibly, but it's just much easier to get cooperation for the pro-social parts than for the anti-social parts. Why? Well, if, say, a bunch of companies all meet and they say, here's going to be our system for connecting our phones together. After that meeting, no one company says, suckers, I'm going to go and not do it. All you've done is just unilaterally ruin your product. On the other hand, totally standard if a bunch of companies get together and say we're all going to reduce production and raise prices, they leave it, and then they do all say, suckers, you can cut your production all you want. I'm going to expand my production. And that is the difference, is that the pro-social cooperation where you're standardizing the product and making them compatible with each other. That's the kind of thing where once it's agreed, you don't want to back out of that deal because then you're just ruining your own product. But on the other hand, for the anti-social cooperation, where you're trying to give consumers a worse deal, that's one where you want to break that deal with the other firms and actually go and so basically, first of all, call up all your best customers and say, how your prices are going up. Not for you, buddy. Right? You're special. And then you want to call up all of your competitors' customers and say, I heard you're getting a really raw deal here. Well, not from me. I would never treat you that way. Right? And I do have a paper with this with economist Ed Stringham where we go over real world examples that we can find of network industries. And what we see is network industries in general. For the pro-social cooperation, this happens all the time. For the anti-social cooperation, it's much rarer and not very effective. And for the usual reasons that people want to renege on these kinds of deals, and then also it attracts new entry and other issues like that. So this is a bit technical, but that's my answer to that.
Cool. Well, thanks a lot. I'll also post up. So you have a couple of papers about this issue in particular. So I'll post that up as well.
Yep. So. So two things. So, first of all, the book, it's only $20 on Amazon. It's The Case Against Education. So, you can be in your hands tomorrow very easily. And, can you really afford not to buy this book? I don't think so. Right. And then, so secondly, next time you're in Fairfax, let me know. We can get lunch.
That'd be great.
And it's on me.
Thanks a lot, Brian. I appreciate that.
Okay. All right. So, it's been a great interview. Thanks a lot.
Appreciate it.
All right, talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.
And that concludes today's episode of Who Shaves the Barber? Next week, I'll be speaking with Professor Peter Klein about the epistemological view known as infinitism. Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.